Diplomacy During the Cuban Missile Crisis by Amanda Greenmeyer and Amy Alcock.
For 13 days in October 1962, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war.
In 1958, Fidel Castro and his supporters took on the Batista regime of Cuba.
Through guerrilla-style warfare, Castro deposed the ruling government.
Once Batista was gone, Castro had complete power in 1959. He killed or imprisoned those who opposed him. Communism was now established in Cuba.
Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, allied with Cuba.
Khrushchev sent his deputy, Anastas Mikoyan, to observe the situation in Cuba. It was his recommendation that the Soviet Union help Cuba both economically and politically.
After the failed attempt by Cuban insurgents, who were backed by the Kennedy administration at the Bay of Pigs, Khrushchev made closer ties to Castro.
Kennedy tried to navigate through the tensions of the Cold War. Khrushchev and the Soviet government had made it clear that they would bury the West.
On Tuesday, October 16, 1962, a U-2 plane flew over Cuba and reported missile silos being constructed. The White House was convinced that the Soviet Union was placing nuclear weapons in Cuba. Discussion began on how to address the problem. Two things were offered: an airstrike invasion or naval quarantine.
On October 17th, American military units were moved to bases in the southeast, as photos showed that there were additional sites in Cuba.
October 18th, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko visited Kennedy to tell him that the missiles did not represent a threat to the United States.
On October 22nd at 7 p.m., Kennedy addressed the nation over television, which was a new medium for diplomacy. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba, he said. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on the imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
October 23rd, the diplomacy in the crisis was conducted on three fronts: the Kennedy administration, the Soviet Union, and the United Nations. Kennedy wrote to Khrushchev warning the Soviets to take the missiles out of Cuba. Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, Edwin Martin, sought support from the Organization of American States.
Khrushchev and Kennedy corresponded almost daily with letters. Khrushchev, in his letter on October 23rd, refused to take the missiles out of Cuba because they were for defensive purposes. Khrushchev, in his letter, stated, "I must say frankly that the measures indicated in your statement constitute a serious threat to peace and to the security of nations."
We now know that the Soviet Union, not content with Dr. Castro's oath of fealty, not content with the destruction of Cuban independence, not content with the extension of Soviet power into the Western Hemisphere, not content with a challenge to the inter-American system and to the United Nations Charter, has decided to transform Cuba into a base for communist aggression, into a base for putting all of the Americas under the nuclear gun, and thereby to intensify the Soviet diplomacy of blackmail in every part of
That evening, on the 23rd, Kennedy signed Proclamation 3504, which authorized the naval quarantine of Cuba.
On October 25th, United Nations Secretary General U Thant, who believed diplomacy could resolve the situation, asked Kennedy for a cooling-off period, which Kennedy refused because it would leave the missiles intact.
October 26th. In secret, Fidel Castro urged Khrushchev to initiate a nuclear first strike against the U.S. if the Americans invaded Cuba. Diplomacy was now crucial to prevent a nuclear holocaust.
On Saturday, October 27th, Soviet ships were nearing the 500-mile barrier.
October 27th. At an intense meeting of the Executive Committee, President Kennedy refused to order military attacks against the missile sites. Kennedy told the committee that Khrushchev in his last letter wanted the American missiles out of Turkey. The administration decided to ignore that condition for now. Nevertheless, Air Force carriers were ordered to active duty in case invasion was needed.
Americans sat glued to their television sets, watching to see what was going to happen. Would the Soviet ships cross the quarantine line? Walter Cronkite kept the nation informed of the movement of Soviet ships. When he announced that the Soviet ships had turned around, the country breathed a sigh of relief.
October 27th. That night, Robert Kennedy meets with Anatoly Dobrinin, and they reach an agreement that the Soviet Union would withdraw the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, for America would not invade Cuba. In addition, the U.S. would remove its missiles from Turkey.
Khrushchev had announced that the Soviet Union had accepted the proposition.
The Cuban Missile Crisis had come to an end. The crisis has had far-reaching consequences.
The Soviets thought Khrushchev had displayed weakness by giving in to the West. Eventually, Leonid Brezhnev, a hardliner, rose to power. The Soviets had chosen a strong, uncompromising leader who ruled for decades.
After the crisis, an escalated arms race began between the West and the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan would be elected president in 1980, in part because of his hard stance against the Soviets and communism.
Another consequence was the decline of the Democratic Party. Americans felt that the party was soft on communism. After Lyndon B. Johnson's term in office, Republicans would control the Oval Office and Congress up until the 1990s.
Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson. Many believed he micromanaged the brief crisis and escalating Vietnam War. McNamara called the shots in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
He saw that if you pushed the Soviets, they'd eventually back off. Believing this theory, he used it in the Vietnam War. This strategy failed.
When the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba, the island nation remained under harsh communist rule until present day.
The world watches, waiting for the death of Castro. What will happen next?
In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and freedom spread to the Eastern Bloc countries.
There have been many consequences from the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the most tragic involves the Cuban people. They have been denied basic rights by their communist oppressors, economic prosperity, and active participation in the world community.